Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'd like to start by acknowledging and thanking the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon, and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this means a lot to me. If you love the podcast and you never miss an episode, please consider joining the Talking Tudors Patreon community. Visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. Once you sign up, you'll have access to exclusive posts, additional monthly live talks, a member-only book club, patron-only monthly giveaways, to name just a few of the rewards. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Jade Scott to the podcast to talk about her new book, Captive Queen, The Decrypted History of Mary, Queen of Scots. Dr. Scott is an historian specializing in Mary, Queen of Scots, and an expert on her letters. She's an affiliate in history at the University of Glasgow, an associate fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and secretary of the Scottish History Society, researching early modern Scottish women and their correspondence. She lives in Stirling with her husband and 2 St. Bernards. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Welcome to Talking Tudors, Jade. How are you?
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Natalie.
Yes, I've been looking forward to our conversation. So perhaps we can just begin with an introduction, if you wouldn't mind just saying hello to all our listeners and just telling us a little bit about you and your background.
So I am Dr. Jade Scott, and I am an expert in early modern letter writing. So I work a lot with manuscript letters, and especially women's letters, from the kind of late medieval right through to early modern period. And I work with women's letters in lots of different languages. So I work with letters in English, also in older Scots, and kind of continental letter writers as well. So women who are kind of writing to and from France, Spain and beyond. And I have worked on letters since I first did my PhD back in, 2023 to 2017, which is a lifetime ago now. Yeah, I've worked on letters since then, when I kind of was drawn into them by researching a particular early modern woman, Lady Anne Percy, for my thesis. And then I thought, actually, what about someone who has a great deal more letters than the lovely Lady Anne Percy had? Lady Anne Percy, I managed to find 26 during my thesis and thought, wow, that's fantastic. And I thought, well, what about someone who has a lot more than 26? And I was drawn into the world of the letters of Mary, Queen of Scots. And I have been trapped there, but in a nice way, ever since. So yeah, I've been working on Mary for a few years now. Did a postdoc at the University of Glasgow working on Mary's letters, and I have kind of stayed with her ever since. And for a really long time, I thought, while I was working on her letters, I thought, it would be great to do a kind of new biography of Mary that really uses these letters a lot more than they've kind of been used in the past. And that's why we've kind of come together today, I think, Natalie, is to talk about that particular aspect of my work, which is kind of coming out in my new Captive Queen, which is a new biography of Mary, Queen of Scots, using her letters.
Yes, and I'm so excited to talk to you about it because I have to say, Jade, I devoured your book. It was absolutely brilliant. I loved the focus on the letters and just the insight that offers us, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about that. But before we do that, so is this when you first became interested in Mary, Queen of Scots, or did you learn about her earlier on? How did you kind of come to become fascinated with her life?
Absolutely. So I've always been interested in Mary kind of coming through school here in Scotland and then obviously working on the early modern period, working on early modern Scotland. It would be impossible for me not to have engaged with her in different ways because she's such an iconic figure from kind of 16th century Scotland and obviously beyond Scotland as well. But here in Scotland, she remains a really iconic figure. So I was really interested in her and I've always been really interested in kind of 16th century Scottish and English relations, political relations. And so Mary's obviously at the heart of that. And I was always intrigued by how Mary is kind of always set in opposition to Queen Elizabeth of England. So I was kind of interested in that and kind of my own fascination with these kind of two powerful women, having, looked at 16th century Scotland from beyond, even before I did any kind of academic study. But she really became the kind of key focus of my kind of interests when I did that PhD. So when I did my PhD on Lady Anne Percy, the Countess of Northumberland, one of the things that kind of came up whilst I was doing that research was that Lady Anne Percy was kind of really central to a support network of Mary Queen of Scots that kind of crossed different countries and different social groups. And I thought, oh my goodness, this woman who had traditionally kind of been presented to me in this kind of not necessarily negative, but just not as valued, I suppose, as Queen Elizabeth. Elizabeth was always seen as kind of driving force behind the events in the 16th century. And Mary's kind of pushed out a little bit traditionally, I think, from kind of having any power in that period. And when I was looking at Mary through Lady Anne Percy, I thought this is not the case at all. This woman is absolutely directing people around her, both, actively making decisions and making things happen, but also, of course, having a kind of inspirational figurehead position for people, an ideological position for people as well. And I thought, oh, I really need to go back and actually look at this woman properly and try and step back from all these kind of biases that are pushed upon us from the different ways in which people have engaged with Mary in the past. And I was really fortunate to do a postdoc at Glasgow on the Archives and Writing Lives project with Alison Wiggins here, where I really did get to delve a lot more deeply into Mary and use her letters and really start to, as I say, challenge my own preconceptions of her, but then also hopefully kind of encourage other people to kind of really address Mary and kind of reassess her, I suppose, and give her a bit more of the credit that I think she's been long overdue. And so, yeah, something that's always been there, something that I've always been interested in, and I fully admit to being interested in her in that very traditional, setting her up against Queen Elizabeth for a long time. And then, as I say, once I got the chance to actually look at her letters, I thought, no, this is not the way to do it. The woman needs a chance to show off the skills that she absolutely had and that people, in her own lifetime recognised her having. And that's why she was, such a problem for various people, usually men, at various points in the 16th century.
Well, I think she definitely does emerge a much more complex woman. Your narrative certainly does that. So some of our listeners that's okay. Some of our listeners may remember hearing about some new Mary Queen of Scots letters that were found recently. So could you just introduce us to I believe it's 57 letters that were recently discovered in the National Library of France? When were they written and why have they sparked this resurgence of interest in Mary's life?
So this was a really incredible discovery, and it was a team of scholars from different disciplines, George Lasry, Norbert Bierman, and Satoshi Tomokio, who amazingly managed to identify 57 letters, as you say, Natalie, that had never been attributed to Mary before. And, for anyone interested in Mary, this was just a really thrilling thing to have be presented. Normally, we kind of come across one or two letters of Mary every so often. So, we're really fortunate, although it is a bit of a curse as well, that we have thousands of letters surviving to and from Mary. And every so often, one or two will come up, usually to kind of the open market. They'll come up in auction houses, and there's often real kind of competition to get your hands on them. But they're usually, as I say, they're they come in dribs and drabs. So for that team to be able to identify 57 was thrilling. And these were letters that, as you say, had been preserved in the archives in the library in Paris, in France. And they're letters that Mary had sent out during her captivity, mostly from the kind of early to mid 1580s. And they date from around the period of various plots, including one of the plots known as the Throckmorton plot, which is, one of the kind of bigger plots that occurred during Mary's captive years, although there are many of them. And so, yeah, it was really, really exciting that these letters were identified. And the team managed to do this. And again, this in itself is, of course, absolutely thrilling. They managed to do it because these letters that had ended up in France were letters that were almost entirely disguised by code. And the team, led by George Lashley, they managed to develop a program that was able to break that code. And by doing that, they were then able to say, these are letters from Mary that have sat here for hundreds of years. Thank goodness they were preserved by the archivists. And yes, so a really exciting discovery in Mary's life. And I think it has kind of led to people having a kind of renewed interest in her life, in particular in her captive life, the 20 years that she spends in England in various prisons. I think it kind of reminds people as well that although Mary's tale is somewhat familiar, at least to various degrees, we're all quite familiar with, the kind of the so-called tragedy of her life. These new discoveries, I think, remind people that actually, even for someone as iconic and someone who's been studied, so closely for hundreds of years now, she's always kind of got something else hidden away that comes out. And I think that's what people are quite drawn to.
Yeah, I think it's such an extraordinary find. I just can't even imagine for scholars of Mary Queen of Scots like yourself, how incredible this must be to find. One is exciting, isn't it? When you find 57 letters, that is absolutely incredible. And you've obviously mentioned there that they're coded letters, most of them, I think. So can you talk to us a little bit more about the lengths that Mary went to actually hide the contents of her letters? You've mentioned ciphers and codes. I believe there was also a certain way of folding the envelopes. I'd love to hear more about that.
Absolutely. And this is one of the really kind of intriguing aspects of Mary's correspondence during her captive years is the lengths that she goes to disguise her correspondence or to employ clandestine techniques to try and minimize the amount of interception that's going on. So during the 20 years of her captivity in England, she is linked to various plots, some to varying degrees. And as that 20-year period drags on, the kind of English authorities and the agents around Elizabeth become ever more determined to find evidence against Mary that will allow them to somehow deal with the problem of Mary in a much more final way. And so they start to limit her access to kind of regular open channels of communication via letters. And so she has to turn more and more to these clandestine techniques. And she uses codes and ciphers, as we've mentioned. And these codes, there are hundreds of letters to and from Mary that are in code. Some of them are entirely disguised. So, you look at it and it does look a bit kind of gobbledygook on a first impression, which of course is the intention. Others are not quite as explicit, so you have different layers of code in Mary's letters. So sometimes the letters are, plain text. She writes what she's trying to say, but she will disguise people's names or she'll disguise places. So sometimes she will, use numbers instead of letters. So places are often disguised using numbers. Sometimes she use kind of nicknames or by names for people. So there's a nice example that comes up in letters between Lady Anne Percy and Mary Queen of Scots, and more broadly within that big network that I mentioned at the start of support around Mary that Lady Anne is involved with. And they refer to someone who's known as the Tailor of Newcastle, and we still don't know who the Tailor of Newcastle is. It's most likely that he or she is a kind of agent based in England who's helping get communication to where it's supposed to go, but we don't actually know for sure who this person is. So that's another way in which people can, disguise things. And it's quite nice, actually. Those letters are quite nice when you come across them, because certainly with Lady Anne Percy's letters, you'll see people like William Cecil, Elizabeth's principal supporter, of course, who will note in the margin, who'll underline phrases or nicknames or, kind of bywords and codes that are embedded within plain text letters. And he underlines it and then he'll write in the margin who he thinks it might be or, suggestions. So you get codes like that are maybe not as dramatic as the ones that are, entirely symbolic, but you still have ways of disguising. But as you said, there are other ways in which you can kind of disguise correspondence. or attempt to control the process of the reception of your correspondence. And one of the ways in which you can do that is by folding your letter in different ways that offer more and more security. And the fantastic work of the letter locking team, who've done great work to kind of tease out all the different complex layers of how you fold your letter and what that might mean. So yeah, you can find out more from the letter locking project online. But one of the ways in which Mary has been shown to use the kind of folding and letter locking practices to help secure her letters is to use a really complex way known as the spiral lock. And the spiral lock is where you would cut a kind of slither, I suppose, a dagger shaped paper from the page that you're writing on. You'd cut it from the margin, but you'd leave it attached. You wouldn't cut it free. And then you'd fold your letter up and stab that through and thread that through, which means that if someone were to get their hands on your letter before it reaches the person you want it to go to, if they opened it, that little lock would snap off inside, and then you wouldn't be able to put it back together, so anyone would notice immediately if it's been tampered with in any way. Other ways of folding as well that Mary uses is a way known as kind of accordion folding, or a plait, a letter where you fold it up in alternate directions until it becomes really, really tiny. And it's so small that these types of letters are really easy to, slip out without people noticing them. So they can literally be slipped up the sleeves of ladies' gowns, or they can be, slipped into a pocket of men's clothing. Sometimes they're hidden in the heels of shoes because they're so small that they can just, be popped right in. And so these clandestine letters, we know that Mary's using techniques like this as well to try and avert unwanted eyes. So yeah, she has lots of different techniques, lots of different options, and she uses different ones at different times depending on what might be the most useful to her.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. Is there any idea of when or where she would have learnt these techniques? Is this something that kind of all royalty would have learnt to protect correspondence, or is this because Mary's in this precarious situation of being captive for 20 years?
So it's actually, yes, it would have been a skill that, educated men and women would have learned. And so, we find it quite a lot in royal correspondence, as you say, Natalie. And then it kind of, trickles down into the kind of noble and elite culture. And even, over a lengthier period of time, you do start to see it coming up in things like merchants' letters and beyond. But it was something that would have been learned as you're learning the formal art of letter writing. So you would have learned, what was proper and fit and how you would address people. And as part of that, you would learn all the material culture around it. So, these exact things like, what does it mean if you fold a letter in this particular way? What are you trying to demonstrate? But for me, of course, there is, this added incentive to use these skills because she is, of course, being held captive. So the material features can kind of have a dual function for Mary. So they have this purpose of security, but they also still have these kind of social, pragmatic functions that were much more widely understood amongst noble cultures in the period across Europe. So she's very clever at using these types of things. She is using them for security function, but she also uses them for these kind of social interactions as well. And so, the way that she folds a letter can be because she's trying to make it really small so that it's easy to get out. But other times it can be that she is making a marked comment on who it is that she's addressing. So she's either trying to be really accommodating and try and set up a positive interaction, a kind of positive feeling of the relationship between herself and the person she's writing to. And on other occasions, she might do things that are intentionally designed to be a bit more of a snub. So poor William Cecil, I say poor William Cecil, I mean, Mary would say, how dare you? The man deserved it. But with William Cecil, she often uses material features as a really obvious marker to contemporaries that she is, despite her deteriorating circumstances, that she is very much aware of her status being higher than his, and it will always be so. So it's really fascinating to dive into the little kind of features of her letters and these different layers, because I think we get a lot out of it that can be really easily overlooked. So yeah, I think that is one of the things she does really well, even as her circumstances get worse and worse, sadly.
Yeah, I find that's a fascinating features of letters of this period, as you say, so easily overlooked if you're not looking for it. But I love how even, position of your signature, how much blank paper you're leaving. It's just all so, so fascinating. I can see why you've spent so much time studying this area. So, Jade, you talked earlier about the fact, of course, that Mary's correspondence is kind of at the heart of your biography. So tell us what insights these letters actually offer in terms of Mary and her time in captivity.
Mary's letters actually offer quite a lot. I mean, I know I'm biased, but I think they do offer quite a lot of insight into her skill as a queen. And she is of course a captive, but she considers herself the entire time up until her death. She sees herself as a reigning queen who's being held unjustly, and held unjustly by, a kingdom that is separate from her own. So there's a whole other layer of political complexity there. But I think her letters really demonstrate her skill in maintaining her self-fashioning as a queen. The ways, just, some of the things we've touched upon, but the way in which she interacts with people, the way in which she addresses people through her letters and uses materiality really does demonstrate that she is maintaining her status as a queen, regardless of how bad things are on a day-to-day basis for her. So that's one of the key things that I think Mary's letters do. The other thing that I think her letters offer is insight actually to exactly what I'd been kind of searching for when I first came to use her letters. So maybe I am, again, being a bit biased, but I think if you look at her letters in a really kind of formal way and you take them apart and you look at the different aspects of them, I think her letters demonstrate that she is someone with agency, that she is a woman with agency despite, again, the circumstances of her life being a captive in England. She uses her letters to direct the people around her, and sometimes that's successful and sometimes of course it's not, because there are certain things she can't overcome. But her letters do show her having agency, being proactive. She's not always reacting to things, things that are out with her control, both locally and internationally. Yes, she does have to react to, but she is always trying to be proactive in A, trying to set herself free, of course, but B, as things progress and it becomes clear to her that she's unlikely perhaps to be freed, then she changes her tactic and she still tries to be proactive, but she tries to be proactive in preserving how she will be memorialised and how she will be remembered after her death. So I think at every stage of her captivity, this is a woman who is active, who has agency, and she demonstrates that agency through her letters. And that, I think, is really, really important to remember from Mary, because it's something that I think we've kind of taken away from her over the centuries. Biographers and historians have kind of taken that away from her, because retrospectively it's easy to go, well, we know the ending, we know what's going to happen to you, so clearly you were unsuccessful. But she doesn't know really what's going to happen. At various points she has suspicions, but she doesn't know how it's going to end, and so she does act with agency. She doesn't just sit back and let things happen to her. And so I think that's really important, that we give Mary that space, and I think her letters do demonstrate that. And they demonstrate a woman. This is another thing that I always think is really important for Mary, and something that I really have come to love her for, actually, is that I think her letters demonstrate that this is a woman who is unceasingly resilient. Yes, she has periods of physical and mental ill health, as we all would. I'm not sure actually that I would have done as well as her in the circumstances, but she is resilient to the end. She is someone who is determined to preserve her status. She's determined to be acknowledged for that status. She is someone who does not just let other people try to take over. When, for example, there are various plots to set her free that end up with French or Spanish support, and when they then fail, as most of them inevitably do, she is very quick to turn around and go, no, that wasn't me. I didn't ask them to do that. I would never ask them to do that. But that's a strategy. It's plausible deniability. She can't turn around and go, yep, I asked for that amount of money and I asked that money to go to pay for those soldiers. She's not, going to just walk right into that. She has to say, nope, that's nothing to do with me. But that doesn't then mean that she wasn't involved in directing the events around her. So I think it's really important that we strike that balance of recognising what she's actually doing with her letters and how those letters can actually be quite strategic. And that's the kind of key thing for me is to give her that space. And I think by looking at her letters and understanding them within the culture of her own time, that is how we do give her that space to reclaim her agency and to be recognised as someone who is resilient and who is strategic as well.
Yeah, there's such important points. I find exactly the same, that I think sometimes we kind of forget that these people are actually responding to things that are happening in their lives, and they don't know how, just like you and I live our lives, we don't know how things are going to turn out. And it's so easy to forget that when you're looking at people from the past, and we're looking at it with hindsight. So such a great point. Completely agree with you there. So can you tell us a little bit more, Jade, about who she was corresponding with? You've obviously mentioned Cecil there. Who else was she writing letters to or receiving letters from?
Writing letters to and receiving letters from a whole bunch of characters. If you want to look, Mary's letters could literally be a who's who of the 16th century. She is writing to everyone, or people are writing to her. So there's a mix really between three camps, I suppose. We could break it down. They're a bit arbitrary because they overlap, of course, but it's quite helpful to think of them as three groups. You have the correspondence between Mary and her Scottish supporters, so the people back in Scotland who are still holding out for her, who are still supportive of her restoration, and who would like to see her come back to Scotland. So you see her corresponding with them, with those supporters. Then we have the kind of European correspondence, I suppose, which is not to set Scotland apart from Europe, of course, but just to kind of, help clarify the different camps, as I say. You have the European correspondence where she's writing and receiving letters from people who might be helpful to her in Spain and in France. Occasionally letters make it to the Vatican and back as well, but primarily France and Spain are the two international groups of supporters that she relies upon. So we see a lot of correspondence, a lot of international correspondence coming through there. And then the last kind of group is the kind of English correspondence, and that is her writing to either people like William Cecil, who are, responsible for her captivity to some degree and who can help alleviate some of the poorer circumstances of her everyday life. So you see her writing to Cecil. She also corresponds with Walsingham later on. She writes, of course, to Queen Elizabeth herself. There are lots of letters from Mary to Elizabeth, not so many back, which is a really interesting dynamic, of course. But you have a lot of letters from Mary to Elizabeth, and Elizabeth's kind of close supporters as well. So she'll write to Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, because she recognises, of course, this is a way in, perhaps, to try and get something from Elizabeth. So you have that as the English correspondence. But you also have really intriguing examples in the English correspondence where she's writing to perhaps nobles who are not quite as loyal to Elizabeth and certainly not as supportive of men like William Cecil. So this is how we end up, of course, with the letters to Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, during the late 1560s and into the very early 1570s before he is executed. So you see her kind of, again, being quite strategic with her letters. Even looking at those English letters, you have her writing to people who she doesn't particularly want to write to. She doesn't want to write to Cecil. She doesn't want to acknowledge Cecil as having any kind of power over her. And one of the ways in which she tries to deal with that, as I say, is by snubbing him using different kind of aspects of the letters. But she knows she has to. If she wants, more firewood, if she wants an allowance for Shrewsbury to be increased, and the Earl of Shrewsbury, her long-time custodian, she has to write to these men. But she also writes to people who she discovers might not be as supportive as Elizabeth, and therefore might be receptive to turning their attention to her. So yeah, we see her using her letters to write to all sorts of people. And another kind of key aspect that cuts right across all three of those kind of arbitrary camps is that we see her writing to and receiving letters from other women. So women are really at the heart of Mary's correspondence. So in the Scottish supporters camp, you have women like Lady Ferniehurst or Agnes Lady Livingston, who's with Mary for a short period and then returns to Scotland in 1572, and they continue to write to one another. In the European correspondence, you see her writing to kind of French women and also, of course, to people like Lady Anne Percy and there's the Feria, for example, in Spain as well. So you see these women kind of everywhere across Mary's correspondence, and that, I think, is a really interesting kind of aspect of her letters as well, is, you know, how embedded women are in it. Women are absolutely central to Mary's letters. So yeah, it's a whole bunch of people, and for different purposes at different points.
So in terms of Mary's letters, is she writing the letters herself, or is there a secretary that's writing? Do we see any pattern with who she writes to personally, that sort of thing?
Absolutely. So she has two secretaries with her for the most part while she's in England for, you know, the almost 20 years that she's a captive. She has a Scots secretary, Gilbert Curl, and she has Claude Now, her French secretary, and they're with her for the ballpark of that period. Not all of it, they change early on, but for most of it, those are the two key secretaries that she has. And she relies upon them a great deal. Partly this is not unexpected, because monarchs in this period would not have been expected to write all of their letters in their own hand. They would have been receiving thousands of letters and petitions, and, you know, letters would have gone through a series of different clerks before they reached the monarch. And it would only have been in certain circumstances that a monarch would write in their own hand. So it's not unusual for Mary to have these secretaries with her and use them a lot. Mary, of course, because of the circumstances, being a captive, does have to use her own hand a lot more than we might find in a traditional reigning monarch, because, you know, sometimes her secretaries are perhaps out doing different tasks, they're not available to her. Other times she thinks it's actually more effective if I write in my own hand, because if I write in my own hand, it's showing the person that I'm writing to that I'm willing to make the effort, that they are important enough to me, that I'm going to write to them myself. And all of these things can help just persuade people in the right direction. So yes, we see a mix of letters that are in her own hand and those that are written by secretaries. And the secretaries become really important. They're really important for her, of course, on a lived experience level, but they become really important to her story towards the end, with the final plot that kind of arises in 1585, thereabouts, the Babington plot, because letters that are sent between Mary and the plotters are written up by her secretaries, and she, you know, relies on that at her final trial by saying, you know, no, I definitely didn't say that. It may have been altered at some point because, you know, I've maybe drawn up a draft, or I maybe gave them oral instructions and then they've changed it. And again, part of that's plausible deniability, but part of it is reflective of the collaboration that she has with her secretaries. So yeah, the secretaries are really important for Mary. And actually, you know, just very briefly as well, Natalie, like if you look at the thousands of letters that I say we have to and from Mary over her entire life, not just the time in England, you know, most of them are secretarial letters, because, you know, this is a woman who would have been receiving thousands of letters as Queen of France and then Queen of Scotland, you know, so lots of them actually are not in her own hand. And that's a really important point, I think, that's worth just mentioning, yeah.
And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what Mary's letters reveal about her relationship with her son.
So the letters relating to James VI, and of course then James I of England after Mary and Elizabeth's death, are really, really interesting letters. So we actually have more surviving examples from James to Mary than we do from Mary out to James. And there are really, really few examples of Mary writing to James. That's not to say she's not writing to him. We know she is, because she's receiving his letters back, and other people make note, generally her jailers and other English agents make note of correspondence going between the two of them. But it's a really kind of interesting absence, I suppose, in that we don't have as many letters as we might expect. And the reason for that, of course, is that Mary is writing to James across this period of being physically distanced. But whilst he is a youth, while he's a child, before he comes into his independence, they are often stopped from getting to him. So the various regents of Scotland and their factions, it's in their interest to keep him both physically and emotionally distanced from Mary, and so he doesn't really receive a lot of Mary's letters, and they often come with gifts. So we know that she's sending horses and books and toys at various ages of his life, and so he doesn't get a lot of them. It's only when he becomes a kind of an adult, really, and kind of steps out from the various regents of Scotland, that we start to find more surviving correspondence, and it's mostly, as I say, from him to her. And that's really interesting because they show this kind of attempt to preserve some kind of relationship between mother and son. And James always kind of addresses his mother very deferentially. He describes himself as your, most humble and most obedient son. So there are intriguing aspects there, but again, we have to be careful because, it would have been really common practice in the 16th century for children to address their parents in that fashion. So he's not necessarily revealing anything about how he really feels about his mother. It's just an expectation of that is the appropriate way to address her. And in Mary's letters, one of the key kind of little snippets that we have is that in one of the many, many cipher keys that were found in her papers when she's taken to trial, and they're now in the State Papers queue in London, is a cipher symbol for the Prince of Scotland, and it's a little love heart. And I just find this one of the most moving kind of little tiny details of this correspondence, that the symbol for her son is a love heart. And I can imagine, actually kind of Victorian biographers who were determined to absolutely demonize her, seeing that love heart and going, oh my goodness, it must have been Bothwell, or it must have been Darnley, it must have been Norfolk, it has to be a man, it has to be romance, because, Mary's obviously always about trying to find a new romance. And of course it's not, it is representative of her son. So I find that really moving. But it's also, once again, there's a kind of other side of the coin, because although it is a love heart, which perhaps suggests, an attempt to have some kind of closeness and some kind of devotion between one another, at the same time, in the cipher, he is glossed as Prince of Scotland, never King of Scotland. She never acknowledges James as King of Scotland because she is Queen of Scotland. There already is a Queen of Scotland. So how can she possibly acknowledge her son as an independent King of Scotland without, disinheriting herself? And so she never does that. So the letters are really, really intriguing, actually, and tell us a lot, even in absence, about what's going on and the kind of difficult relationship that they have for different periods.
And I'm just curious to know what you think about, obviously, Mary is executed. I think we all know that part of the story, and buried at Peterborough. But then, of course, James moves her later to Westminster Abbey. Do you think that's about emotion, or do you think that's about status and position and power?
I think it is about making a statement rather than it being driven by any genuine desire to kind of show some kind of affection to his mother. Because, of course, Mary is buried at Peterborough, as you say, Natalie. She asked to be buried in France. So if he was trying to kind of demonstrate, a level of love and affection for his mother, it might be more appropriate for him to have her removed from Peterborough and translated to somewhere in France, which is where she wanted to go. And that's not what happens, of course. And by putting her in Westminster, he's emphasising his own kind of royal bloodline, really. He's putting her at the centre of the English line of kings all the way back. And that is quite respectful, and that's something that Mary would have, she wanted for herself. So you can kind of see, maybe there's something in it there. But it's also more powerful for him to say, I am both the King of Scots still, but you can trace me all the way back to the English line of succession. And so I think it is about making a statement. I also think it's really important, of course, that he puts her alongside Elizabeth. And what the two of those women would have thought about that themselves, I think, again, their kind of decision or their thoughts on that have been overlooked. But again, for James, it's really important to put Mary alongside Elizabeth because, once again, he's bringing these two women together. Through him, he physically embodies both of their lines. And so I think it is more about making a political statement of his own power. I don't blame him for it. I'm not suggesting that we need to, rag on him for it, but I think it's a bit, I'd be pushing it a bit far, I think, to say that it's an attempt of him to, make recompense for the lack of action that's taken before Mary dies.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense, actually. And so you talked earlier about the fact that Mary corresponds with Walsingham, of course, as one of the many people she corresponds with. Can you tell us what role he ends up playing in Mary's downfall?
Absolutely. So he is very much at the heart of Mary's downfall. And I mentioned very briefly this final plot, the Babington plot, and this really should be called the Walsingham plot because poor Anthony Babington, who it's named after, who's one of the gentleman plotters, who is part of this scheme in 1585, 1586 that intends to free Mary. But the kind of key distinction between the Babington plot and all of the previous schemes that Mary is implicated in is that the Babington plot goes further than simply saying we will free Mary. They acknowledge that the only way they could possibly successfully free Mary is to assassinate Elizabeth. You cannot have a free Mary whilst Elizabeth lives. And so this is the kind of key difference between the Babington plot and everything that's gone before. And it's also the key reason why it's the one that brings Mary down. Because when she's implicated in other plots, she's able to say, well, all I did was try and prove my own circumstances, which I have a right to do. But by plotting to kill the Queen of England, you are, of course, taking things a step further that cannot be taken back. And although Mary goes on to say that she's not aware that the plotters wish to kill Elizabeth, she has signed the Act of 1585, which meant that anyone who was party to any kind of plot that, even thought about killing Elizabeth, then they are free to be tried as traitors. And that is, of course, what happens to her. So she is aware on that, on a level that, although she doesn't explicitly acknowledge it. But yeah, I said that the Babington plot should really be called the Walsingham plot, and I think that's because this is a plot that he doesn't engineer. It's unnaturally occurring in that sense. It is a scheme that comes together with kind of disaffected Catholic young men in England, kind of clandestine priests who are coming back and forward from the continent into England, and then develops formal Spanish support later on as well. There are connections with France. Mary's kind of cipher clerk, Thomas Morgan, who is imprisoned in France at this point in the Bastille, he's very much involved in directing it. So it is a genuine plot that kind of flourishes from the ashes of the previous one, the Throckmorton one, which fails a few years before. So it's a real thing. What Walsingham does is he finds out quite quickly that this is brewing, and he sees it as an opportunity. So rather than stamping it out immediately when he first finds any evidence of the plot, he decides to wait and let it carry on to such a point, and his hope is that if he lets it carry on, he will be able to trap Mary and find that key piece of evidence that shows she is plotting to kill Elizabeth. So there are various points in the Babington plot where things could have been stopped and they are not, and this is partly because Walsingham is in the background pulling strings and making it go a little bit further. And he turns various kind of peripheral figures. So he has double agents working for him that Mary and the plotters think are working for them. Gilbert Gifford being the main one. He's the letter carrier. He actually works for Walsingham. And so he's very much directing that plot. Not, as I say, it's not his plot in the sense of creating it. He doesn't imagine a scenario and then throw Mary into it. She does involve herself in a genuine scenario, but he just lets it go a little bit further and makes sure that evidence comes up. And one of the key ways he does that in the end is that one of the letters Mary writes to Anthony Babington, where he has specifically said to her, we're going to do this, we're going to try and free you, what should we do? And she gives advice on, well, you'll need this many horses and you might want to take me to Ireland because that would be a secure way of getting me out. She gives advice, but that's all she does. And then when that letter reaches or is sent out to Babington, Walsingham has Gilbert Gifford, his double agent, bring it in, and it's brought into Walsingham's cryptographers and they decode it. And they go, there you go, this is what it tells us. And he goes, that's good, but it's not quite good enough. I need something concrete. And so they add in a little extra bit to the letter in code that says basically, tell me the name of the 6 gentlemen who will kill the Queen. And that's the kind of key thing. When that then goes to Babington goes, it's us, this is what's going to happen. And so it's very much been kind of navigated by Walsingham to his own advantage and to poor Mary's disadvantage, of course. So he is a really important figure for several years before that plot, but certainly towards the end of her life, Walsingham is there really, really pushing things in a particular direction. And she finds it quite hard to get out of that kind of his tailwind. He's so powerful in sense of not just the actual power that he has to direct things, but his own sense of mission, I suppose, to do what they think is right for Queen and country. And Mary, by this point, has had 20 years of disappointment and challenge and deteriorating circumstances and lots of things just kind of progressively getting worse at various points. So she's not quite at her best. She's not quite as good as she has been. And I think for Walsingham, that's a really key point. And for Mary, of course, it is too, but in a much less positive way.
Yeah, I can just imagine how exhausting it must have been by the end for Mary. That's how I sort of felt coming to the end of your book. I was so in the story that I just felt, oh, I'm just so tired of this. And I wonder if she kind of felt a little bit like that towards the end. Wow, what an incredible story. So, Jade, I've seen conflicting evidence about what happened on the eve of the execution. Did Mary actually write letters to people on the night before she was executed?
So we know that she at least wrote one letter before she is taken to be executed in the morning. It's clear that she's writing one letter. She's probably writing more than one, but as it stands, we only really have one that's been preserved. It's a letter that she writes to her brother-in-law, the King of France, and she writes this letter in her own hand because after the trial at Fotheringay, where she is condemned, although she doesn't receive the warrant at that point, but she's found guilty of treason. Her secretaries are not allowed to return to her. So we know that any letters written from the trial onwards are definitely, in her own hands because there's no one there. Although I say that she does have a few ladies with her, but not her noble ladies. They've all gone by that point. So it's very likely that these are letters she's writing herself. And this kind of final letter, or the last letter as it's come to be known, is in the National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh. And you can look at it online, actually. It's been digitised. And it's a letter she writes in French. And she is a kind of mix of stoic and outraged. She kind of talks about how she is disgusted that she's to be executed as a common criminal because she can't possibly be a traitor because she's not a subject of England. So how could she possibly, enact treason in any way? She talks about that, but she also talks quite stoically about the fact that she's willing to die for her faith, that she believes that that is the real reason that the English are executing her, is that it's because of her faith. They find her faith a threat. So she's quite stoic about that. And then quite movingly, she also makes requests of the King of France that he will help support some of her ladies and her servants and find them new positions, or pensions so that they are not left without any support. So it's a really fascinating letter. It's the last letter. It's the last one we have. It's certainly the latest dated one. And she talks in it about, I am to be executed in the morning. So it is, the last letter in that regard. But there may well have been others. They've not survived as far as we know. They could be hiding somewhere, maybe in a private collection even. But yes, we know that she is writing letters the night before her death. And I think part of that as well is that she'd asked for her papers to be returned to her so that she could return to her will and testament, which she draws up at various points across her life when she thinks she might die. And they say no, they say you're not allowed to have access to those types of papers. And so I think one of the things that she has left to her is to write letters. She's also not allowed to have a Catholic priest attend on her. They offer to give her a preacher from the Church of England and she refuses. And so I think this is one of the few things she has left to her on that evening. And I think she turns to letters partly because that is one of the few things she has left. And I think it probably would have been a means of not distraction because she's talking about her impending death in the letter, but a way of not having to sit with your thoughts of that horrible thing that's coming, of course. So it's a really remarkable document.
Oh, I didn't know it had been digitized, so I'm going to have to go and have a look for that. Thank you for letting us know.
Yeah.
And
it's on the National Library of Scotland website. You can just Google Mary's last letter and it should take you there.
Oh, wonderful. I'll add a link to our show notes for our listeners to have a look as well. So just to start bringing our conversation to a close, would you mind just summing up for us the character of the woman that you came to know during your research?
I think for me, Mary is a woman of extraordinary resilience. She's determined. She can be quite dogmatic. That sometimes verges into stubbornness and dogmatism. And certainly some people around her, even her very close supporters, say, oh my goodness, this woman is so stubborn. Once she's made her mind up, she's made her mind up. But I can respect that. I totally respect that of her because I think considering the deterioration of her circumstances that happens over these 20 years, the fact that she is so committed to her own sense of worth, her own sense of status, the fact that regardless of what is happening, she is a queen and no one will ever stop her from being a queen. And I think there's something really powerful in that. So yes, she's a woman that I've come to have a great deal of respect for, but she's also a woman, that having worked on the book and worked with her letters for a long time now, she's also a woman I think who is not just this kind of cardboard cutout of either victim or, tyrant. She is somewhere in between, as everyone is, as we all are. We all have facets of our personality that are maybe ones we're not particularly proud of. And I think looking at Mary's letters as well, one of the things that I've come away with is She is someone who is, very generous. She's very kind to her servants. She's incredibly devoted to her women, but she's also a woman who, when pushed, can really lash out in really quite spectacular ways. And her letters offer evidence of her being, really quite vitriolic in certain circumstances. And I think that's a positive thing to draw out of her because it does show her as a person who, has her good moments, has her bads, makes some bad decisions, but ultimately is this really strong woman for these 20 years of captivity. And I think that's something that she deserves to be recognised for.
Absolutely. I was just thinking, you are almost describing a couple of other Tudor queens that I know there, Jade, but we'll leave it at that. So the very last thing that I like to do on episodes of Talking Tudors is what I call 10 to go. So these are just 10 questions just to get to know you a little bit better. So the first one is, do you have a favourite historic site associated with Mary, Queen of Scots?
I have to confess that my favourite historic site associated with Mary is actually Stirling Castle. Now, I have to be honest here, folks, and say that I live 5 minutes from it. I can see it from my window.
Wow.
So I am very biased. But it's my favourite Mary site. It's a site that we know she's obviously visiting a lot. It's where she has this fantastic, fabulous celebration for the baptism of James VI. And it goes on for a whole week, and everyone is absolutely astounded at the time by how incredible it is. And I just think it's absolutely fascinating to imagine her having these incredible, lavish celebrations there. And we also know that I mean, it's an apocryphal story, but that she would come out of Stirling Castle and dress as a kind of servant woman and go about the streets of Stirling with her women. So I find that a really kind of personal tie because I can literally walk around those places and imagine her doing it. So I would have to say Stirling Castle, even though it's not one of the big ones that come up. People think Loch Leven, and those are very evocative places. But Stirling Castle is just a fantastic place.
Oh, I have had the pleasure of visiting, and I totally agree with you. Very atmospheric. And what about a book that you've read more than once?
Well, when it comes to Mary, the book that I've read over and over again is John Guy's biography of Mary Queen of Scots, My Heart Is My Own. I have a real kind of personal love for that book. I remember reading it back before I kind of even started on any kind of research or PhD or anything and just absolutely loving it. He has such a fantastic style. He is so great at bringing the period in Mary's life to life, really. So that's the one I read over and over again to do with Mary. That's my kind of favourite, I suppose, biography of all the biographies to do with Mary is the John Guy one. That's the one I go back to. He's also the absolute best when it comes to things like the casket letters and stuff. And I absolutely, totally relied on his fantastic scholarship when I kind of very briefly touch on them in the book. So yeah, I urge people to go to it if you've not read it before.
Wonderful. Thank you. And of course, you've written books and you've done lots of study and writing. So do you have any rituals that you like to follow when you're working?
Yes. So I like to write later on in the day. I am not always at my best in the mornings. My husband would say I most certainly am not at my best in the morning. I am, as we say in Scotland, crabbit in the morning. I am not particularly pleasant. So you've got me on a good day. You've got me on a good day today, Natalie.
You're doing really well then.
I am an afternoon evening person. I also have this ritual of I like to write when it starts to get dark so that I can be quite cozy. I can have lamps and candles on. We have an open fire here in the house, so I like to light the fire. So that's my kind of ritual. My ritual is almost kind of quite witchy, I suppose, of turning out all the lights and getting very atmospheric. And I have the benefit, of course, that here in Scotland it does get dark at this time of year, at least by about 3 o'clock. So at least I'm not, up all night writing. So that's my kind of writing ritual, I suppose.
Oh, I love it. That sounds really atmospheric and cozy. Love it. And what about the last film or perhaps series that you watched?
I have been on tenterhooks, of course, for the new series of Wolf Hall. So I haven't watched the episode which came out, of course, at the weekend there. I haven't watched it yet because my husband is in the process of catching up. So we have actually been watching Wolf Hall from the beginning. So that's actually the most recent thing that we've been watching in preparation for the final series, which I am most excited about.
And what about a new skill that you'd like to learn?
Well, I would love to learn to be fluent in Scottish Gaelic. So I am very much at my beginner stage of learning Gaelic. I have lots of fantastic colleagues, of course, who work in Celtic and Gaelic and who have been incredible, in my work on Mary, but also more broadly on Scottish women and women letter writing in Scotland. And I have been trying to learn Gaelic, but I am very much at the beginner kind of stage. So yeah, my new skill would be to be a bit more fluent in Scots Gaelic. So that's the language I'm trying to improve.
And Jade, if you're not feeling particularly inspired on a day where you're hoping to do some writing or some creative work, how do you find inspiration? What kind of gets you into that creative mode?
I find that getting out and going for a good long walk, my giant dogs, so I have two St. Bernards, and getting out with them, I always find that is the best thing for when I have writer's block or when I'm even just kind of stuck in my own head, with life really. Getting out with them is the best way to just clear my head. And I always find coming back, I actually find when I'm out on the walk, then you start to find your mind because you're relaxing and you're kind of drifting away. Things start to come into your head. You go, actually, yeah, that makes good sense. And then when I come back, I'm a bit more ready to attack whatever it is that's kind of been hogging me down. So yeah, I like to get out and about with my giant bears.
Oh, I think you're going to have to send me a picture of those giant bears. I need to see what they look like now.
Yes.
So, what about a travel destination, perhaps one that you haven't visited yet that you would like to?
I'm staying quite close to home with this one, Natalie, because for a long time, but certainly more recently, I've been reading a lot about this place and I really would love to go. I'd love to go to Orkney. So I've been to various places in Scotland and I love the Highlands and my husband and I go to the Highlands every year, a few times a year. And I would happily, if my husband didn't have to be in Edinburgh for work, I would have us moving up there in an instant. I just love it. It's the most incredible place, the kind of the Northern Highlands especially. But I would really love to go to Orkney. I would love to see all the prehistoric sites there. It's another area of history that I've not studied formally. I've never, done any kind of ancient history, but I love it. I love ancient history so much. And I love the fact that we have so many incredible sites on Orkney that you can go and visit. And so, yeah, Orkney is somewhere I'd really love to go for the history, but also for this kind of dramatic landscape that they have up there that's like nothing that we really have on Scotland, in terms of being, largely treeless in particular. So I'd really love to go to Orkney. That's my next place, I think, that I'd like to visit.
Yeah, Scotland is so beautiful. I have to say, you're very, very lucky to live in such a picturesque, but also, I don't know, it inspires creativity, I think, lots of places in Scotland. So when you were a child, Jade, what did you hope to be when you grew up? What work did you want to get into?
I actually wanted to be a medical doctor. I was determined from a very young age that I was going to be a doctor and that I was going to be a surgeon of some type. For a while, I was going to be a heart surgeon, and then other times I was going to be an orthopedic surgeon. And there is, again, I do sometimes like, oh, have I went down, maybe I would have been quite good at that. And then I think, actually, no, Jade, you would not have been that good at it because I would have got so anxious about, obviously, of course, life or death situations that, I get myself all worked up about things now and think, oh my goodness, Jade, how could you actually cope holding people's lives in your hands? You would have been terrible, doctor. You would have crumbled. So, yeah, that was what I wanted to be. And right up through school, I was determined I was going to do it. And then I realised that I really didn't enjoy like maths and physics and things like that. I enjoyed history and literature and modern languages. Yeah, so I decided to go with what I enjoy rather than what I felt I should do.
Well, I think that's good advice to definitely go with what you love, what you're passionate about. And last question for you, what do you like to do to relax and unwind?
I love to ride horses. So that is my kind of escape. I love to ride as often as I can. Even if I'm not riding, just being up at the stables and being around horses, I find it incredibly relaxing. I find horses the most incredible animals. Obviously, I adore my dogs and they do the same kind of job for me, but just being around horses, I find that the most incredible way to switch off. And of course, they're very in tune, I think, with humans and they really pick up on how you're feeling. But also just the kind of physicality that comes with, working with horses. Like, even if I'm really stressed or I'm really overwhelmed, mucking out a stable is such a hard graft that by the time you're done, you've forgotten about it. You've forgot about what you're worried about because you're so focused on the physical task. And same with riding, like if riding well and bringing the horse on. And I find that I don't have time in my brain or
Yeah.
space to worry about anything else. And it's just the most incredible way to switch off.
Yeah, that's so true. Physical activity really does get you out of your thoughts, which is why I think we all love to walk. Lots of people give me that answer about walking when they're kind of stuck, and I certainly do it too. So the very last thing I promise, and then I'll let you get on with your day, is the takeaway. So I ask all my guests for something for our listeners to go off and explore after the episode. So do you have a takeaway for us?
So, I've already kind of cheated because I mentioned the last letter that's in the National Library of Scotland, but that is one of the things that I would urge people to go and have a look at if you've not seen it. It's a really great resource for this remarkable document of Mary's. So that's on the National Library of Scotland. But related to that, I have a second one. There's also, if you search online for the Scottish Archives for Schools and Mary Queen of Scots, you will come up with another link to another digital facsimile of one of Mary's letters. And this is, I love this letter so much, folks. This is a letter that she writes in around about 1550. So she would only have been about 8 years old. And she's writing to her mother, Mary de Guise, from while she is in France and Mary de Guise has returned to Scotland. And it's a fantastic letter. It's so lovely to see a letter from a really young Mary Queen of Scots. And you already can see the iconic handwriting and the signature in development. And it's just lovely. I love it so much. So yeah, those are the two kind of directions I would point you in. I mean, they're both letters, so I kind of cheated. But yeah, if you've not had a chance to look at them, I would go and have a look.
No, what wonderful takeaways. Thank you so much. And I will add links to both of those to our show notes to make it nice and easy for our listeners to find those. And I have to thank you so much, Jade, for taking the time out of your obviously very busy schedule to come onto the podcast and talk about Mary, Queen of Scots with us. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Natalie. I've loved it. It's been great to chat about Mary and yeah, and I love the questions at the end. So yeah, real nice way to end it.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On The Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.